In 2018, Stray Kids debuted with an aggressive, self-produced title track about not knowing who they were, and their sales dropped after debut. People mocked their music and called it construction noise. Most groups would have given in and changed styles, but Stray Kids doubled down, and that decision would eventually change all of K-pop. Most rookie groups in 2018 debuted with something safe. You didn't lead with a thought-provoking message. You definitely didn't put your identity crisis on the title track. JYP Entertainment had built its reputation on exactly that kind of debut. Twice had just proven the formula worked, and the industry was watching to see what they do next. What they did instead was hand 3 18 or so year olds total creative freedom over a new group's entire sound, and let them debut with a song about not knowing who they were. Every track on the album was written and produced by the members themselves, and the entire message they presented with their debut album was about themselves. Take Hyunjin's rap on the title track, for example. Honestly, I don't know who I am. It's frustrating. It always worries me. That wasn't necessarily written to be relatable. It was just how they actually felt. Whether people connected with it was almost beside the point. Because of that, their first day sales of I Am Who, their successor album, dropped by a lot. The audience they'd built through the survival show expected something closer to what the rest of the industry was making. Stray Kids didn't give them that. The group that would eventually become some of the most credited songwriters in Korean music history was losing fans. So if they were dropping in sales, why in the world did they keep making this kind of music? To understand that, we have to go back to before the group even existed. In late 2016, 2 years before any of this, 3 JYP trainees formed a hip-hop unit called 3RACHA, Chris, Changbin, and Jisung. And for a while, all they were was 3 guys making music in their dorms while still training to debut. Here's the thing though, nobody asks them to. JYP didn't encourage them to create a trainee project. 3RACHA were just consistently making music on their own because they wanted to. In early 2017, they uploaded their first mixtape to SoundCloud. Every 2 weeks afterwards, they released an original song and a copy song. That was the pace they set for themselves. No one was checking that they got it done. They just wanted to consistently expand their skills and get their names out there. If you enjoy thoughtful, positive content about Stray Kids like this, consider subscribing. During this period, most of what they were writing about was their own lives as trainees. Chris specifically said they were writing about their own personal experiences. We were talking about how we grew up and what we've been through, how passionate we are about our work, and how that really represents 3RACHA. Take one of their first originals, Runner's High. They were ambitious, determined to make it to debut even without a promise of success. Or look at their copy song, 42, which goes places most idol music wouldn't even consider.
I've been thinking about my life. Is it better if I die?
These are trainees, and just as they mentioned, their careers still depended on earning a debut that wasn't guaranteed. So they wrote it down, because that was what was filling up their minds. That was the thing that mattered to them. Their lives as trainees weren't very pretty. Pretending they were would have meant lying about what they were actually feeling. By the time Stray Kids finally debuted, this was already how 3RACHA made music. So when the debut struggled, and the criticism started pouring in, changing their sound wasn't really an option, so they kept going. However, the next album didn't resolve anything either. A few months later, they released I Am Who. Bang Chan described the difference to us pretty clearly. If I Am Not was about realizing you aren't who you thought you were, I Am Who was about asking who you actually were. And the uncomfortable part was that they still didn't know. There's a song from this period called Voices. During the choreography, the members covered their ears. All those voices hurt me. They weren't trying to be subtle with the pressure they were feeling at this point. They certainly weren't acting like no one was criticizing them. But what they chose to do was write about it. The outside noise was making its way into the music itself, but the process behind the music wasn't getting any easier. Han later admitted that sometimes he made the songs too difficult. Difficult enough that even recording the guide track was hard. When sessions started going badly, he'd get frustrated, asking why nothing was working. And when that happened, Bang Chan would step into the booth and help him figure it out, which Han said he appreciated, even when it stung a little. For about a year, they kept moving forward like that, still writing their own music, still figuring things out in the public's view. Then MIROH released, and for the first time, it actually looked like things were starting to work. The song was louder than anything they'd done before. Sirens, car horns, and a beat that would have perfectly suited a festival crowd. A few weeks later, Stray Kids stood on the stage at M Countdown and heard something announced they'd never heard before. Their name. MIROH was their first win. The members were stunned. You could see by their faces just how surprised they were. Some of them were even so overwhelmed they started crying. But the win didn't settle anything for them. The song was packed with sounds people weren't used to hearing on a title track. For the fans who were already there, they enjoyed the song. Quite a lot, I might add. However, for a lot of other listeners, it was just unpleasant. And that's when the label was placed on them even further. People continue to call Stray Kids noise music, even more now that they've won with the style. And once it started spreading, it became the default way people talked about them. What made it harder for Stray Kids to simply brush off was the fact that the members had been making the songs themselves. This wasn't some random company producer trying to experiment with the song. It was the same three people who'd been uploading tracks to SoundCloud in their dorm rooms. They'd chosen the sample, added the sound effects, written every line, so the criticism wasn't aimed at a sound someone else handed them. It was aimed at exactly what they'd chosen to make. And yet, years later, a rookie group from a competing label would sit in an awards interview and name Stray Kids as the standard they were trying to reach. But in 2019, that future didn't exist yet. Bang Chan admitted later that the doubt crept in on them. We asked ourselves, was this the right decision? Do we have regrets? Did we choose the right way? It was tough for them to know for sure. Because when enough people keep saying the same thing, even the people who made the music start wondering if they're right. And unfortunately for them, they weren't going to understand it for a while. Even with the criticism, they continued to write music. Less than 3 months after MIROH, Stray Kids released Side Effects. The production was denser and more disorienting than anything they'd put out, much more aggressive. If people thought MIROH was too much, Side Effects absolutely wasn't going to change their mind. Rather than adjusting to what people believed they should be, they chose to continue what they believed in, even if they didn't fully understand why they did it yet. JYP easily could have stepped in. They'd seen the backlash Stray Kids were receiving. They knew what people were saying, but they didn't pull control from the members. They let 3RACHA lead the next album with exactly the kind of song that had been causing problems. And the song itself was about that exact feeling. I swallow pills called baseless confidence. Maybe I took too many. Now I'm feeling more worried than confident. Everything is being changed from 1 to 10, the side effects kicking in against my will. They described it as a song about choices, about starting something with confidence and then hitting a point on the road where you start asking whether you picked the right path.
다른 길로 했었으면 어땠을까? 아니면 이 길로 했었으면 좀 더 편하지 않았을까? 더 잘 되지 않았을까? 이런 생각들도 가지게 되는 것 같은데.
Changbin adds that sometimes they regret their choice and want to give up. It's natural for them to feel this way, especially with how many people are demanding they're doing something wrong with their music. So they chose to write a song about it, and they made it sound like that feeling. The people who were used to Stray Kids style and the people who enjoyed it loved the song. They felt seen in the doubts that they carry themselves. In late October, Woojin left the group. JYP released a brief statement citing personal circumstances with his exclusive contract terminated and the comeback pushed back from November to December. The members said nothing publicly about it. Whatever that period felt like inside the group, they kept it there. But the work still had to get done. The album had been built around a full 9 lineup, which meant choreography, recordings, and the whole structure of the comeback no longer fit the way it had before. They had 2 extra weeks and a lot less certainty than they'd started with. Bang Chan said they often lost confidence during the stretch. The MV production was pushed back. Stay started noticing something was off, and the members felt the weight of that too, feeling sorry for letting it show and sorry for the delay, trying to hold it together while things kept shifting around them.
저희는 정말 열심히
저희의 목표를 향해서 진짜 힘차게 나아가고 있었는데 뒤도 안 돌아보고 힘차게 나아가고 있었는데
Levanter came out of that place. Bangchan had been reading a poem with a line that roughly translated as, "The wind is rising, we must try to live," which became the core of the song. Changbin explained the song's meaning as well.
살면서 이게 아니면 안 될 것 같다라고 생각했던 것 그리고 차마 놓지 못했던 것들이 있었을 텐데 그것을 놓았을 때 더 좋은 상황이 생길 수 있고 더 많은 것을 얻을 수 있다 약간 그런 얘기를 하고 싶었고요.
That's not how they had been moving before. For nearly 2 years, Stray Kids had been pushing in one direction. Louder, harder, more. They were trying to force their identity into place. But Levanter doesn't sound like that. They eased up the production. The song almost feels atmospheric and it hits you differently. It doesn't feel like they're trying to prove anything anymore. Not because they gave up, but because they learned something new. They learned that what matters most is the intentionality behind the sound they're producing. It's what took them back to the original dream Sriracha had. In an attempt to prove everyone wrong, they lost the honesty they set out to provide. The lyrics about their personal lives. The members of Sriracha would eventually be sought out to produce other songs for other groups at other labels. But first they had to survive a period where they weren't sure they'd make it through at all. The gap between Levanter and Go Live was the longest they'd taken yet, and then a global pandemic shut down the rest of the world around them. It completely interrupted their first world tour. There was no way to gauge whether anyone was still paying attention, just the members and their work, and quiet, depressing rooms. Hyunjin said he was nervous fans would forget about them. Changbin said it was the first time he had a hard time within his mind. He wasn't sure how to overcome it, and he couldn't tell someone about it. For a group that had spent 2 years pushing forward at full speed, slowing down like this didn't make sense. They'd always been able to outwork whatever was in front of them, but this wasn't something you could outwork. So Sriracha did the only thing they knew how to do. They wrote, and somewhere in that stretch, without any of them necessarily anticipating it, the way they made music started to change. With the Clay series, Sriracha had always started from a concept. They'd decide the message first and build the music around it. That process had given the earlier albums their structure, but it had also boxed them in. Every song had to serve a thesis they'd already committed to. This time, they stopped doing that.
컨셉 같은 건 하나도 잡지 않고 그냥 저희가 하고 싶은 음악을 많이 만들어서
There wasn't any predetermined concept or theme they felt like they needed to prove. Changbin said they wanted it to feel raw and alive.
그 과정 자체가 우리가 여태까지 찾았던 답이지 않나라는 생각으로
They wouldn't know if it actually was, though, until the album came out. But the shift had already happened before God's Menu existed, before they knew what Go Live would become. They'd already let go of the thing that had been limiting them and let themselves write freely, which is when Changbin played them God's Menu. Go Live would be Stray Kids' first full-length album. Not only do full-length albums tend to sell better, but it was a milestone of their career. As per deadlines, they'd already decided the album's title track, and Go Live was in its later production stages. However, Changbin had just written a new song and played it for the members. Hyunjin said he immediately knew he wanted to perform it. The whole group agreed with him, but then the reality of it set in. They'd already recorded the original title track. The album was essentially done, and switching the lead single this late meant undoing finished work and asking a label head to approve something that, by their own account, had never been done at JYP before. They knew it probably wasn't possible. However, they asked anyways.
반란을 일으키는 거죠, 그 노래로.
JYP listened to them. Just as he did a few years back, he chose to trust them. He approved the change, saying the guide track alone made him picture them flying on stage. God's Menu became the lead single. The song was loud, though it was deliberate this time. Sriracha built it around the image of songwriting as cooking, the album as a full-course meal, and Sriracha as chefs who'd finally figured out their own recipe. Changbin said there'd been a cooking drama airing around the same time, which is where the metaphor started. Changbin even considered it a song that only Stray Kids could perform. The confidence here in the statement absolutely wasn't the same kind of confidence they were forcing out during the MIROH era. when they were pushing back against everyone, saying they were wrong, it was because they better understood what their identity was. They finally understood what Stray Kids was meant to be and how to achieve that better. As a result, Go Live broke every sale record they'd set before, but the members weren't really talking about the numbers. IN said God's Menu was the song that best represents Stray Kids, and after that era, he brought up that they look like they're enjoying themselves more, that they feel freer on stage. By 2021, Bang Chan told Teen Vogue the noise music label had become something they could use as their own weapon. Changbin said being called noise music just meant the music really leaves an impression. The thing that had followed them for years, the label that had been meant to dismiss them and kinda really got into their heads, had become part of how they talked about themselves. With all these shifts, it changed how people were finding them and how they were engaging with the group. After God's Menu, Stray Kids were gaining listeners who went backward. People who heard God's Menu first and then landed on MIROH and suddenly understood what it was doing. Side Effects, which had confused people on release, started making sense as part of something bigger. The back catalog didn't change, but the way people heard it did. There was consistent and recognizable identity running through their discography that made earlier songs feel less like scattered experiments and more like steps toward a moment. That kind of recognition comes from consistency, from a sound becoming distinct enough that you can hear a song and know who made it before the name shows up. You can write a fun song similar to what's in the genre already, but you'll never receive any recognition for it. You only begin to truly be recognized when the music you're writing is something new, something that can't be compared to anything else. There's a special quality that comes with this sort of thing. It allows your music to become something singular. For some people, God's Menu wasn't necessarily their best title track, but it was the clearest version of what they'd been building toward. And once people could hear that, everything else kinda just clicked into place around it. Though what happened next was harder to measure than just looking at album sales. People started paying attention to the process itself. People cared about how the music was being made and who was making them. Three Racha had always been there, but now they were more interesting to pay attention to. New listeners weren't just hearing Stray Kids. They were looking up the names behind the music and realizing those names were the members themselves. And what Three Racha got down so well was how unified they were. There was a Stray Kids identity, and there was also an entirely separate Three Racha identity. But what's interesting is that they work hand in hand because they're controlled by the same people. With people actually appreciating who's creating the songs more, credit lists started to circulate significantly more. Fans were pulling them apart, pointing out who wrote what, and specifically praising when different members wrote on their own. Someone would bring up a verse and trace it back to something a member had done years earlier, because they weren't writing nonsensical love songs or generic empowerment tracks. They were writing about their own personal journey. Even outside of Stray Kids fandom, the way people talked about songs was changing. Saying they write their own music carried a different kind of weight than it used to. It wasn't just a detail that people could gloss over, because Three Racha found a way to give that fact an identity, to give it meaning. It was something fans brought up on purpose, and something they often argued about. This shift absolutely didn't stay contained to the fans though. It wasn't all at once, but gradually, the way labels presented their artists started to change. Studio footage and behind-the-scenes videos started to show up much more often than before. The company started encouraging their members to participate in the songwriting process, even if it was just minimally contributing to lyrics. Because when fans of those groups saw the members' names attached to the songs, it gave them reason to feel prouder of their beloved idols. Whereas groups that had always had members contributing to songwriting started centering that fact in their identity instead of just leaving it on the side. Labels started debuting groups by highlighting how involved they are in the production. Cordis, a group who's praised Three Racha as being a huge inspiration, launched as what Big had called a young creator crew, with all 5 of the members holding production credits before they'd even finished their first album promotion. In an interview, Songhyun even talked about wanting to follow in Stray Kids' footsteps, pointing to their achievements as the standard. Certainly none of that traces back to a single cause. Self-producing idols existed before Stray Kids, and reducing the entire movement to one group would flatten something much more complicated. But what 3RACHA did was show that consistently putting themselves out there, and not only sticking to what they believed the industry needed, but evolving their dream, showed that a fourth generation group could build its whole identity around creative ownership and have it work commercially. When people are paying attention to how a group is writing and producing its own music, and also selling out arenas and breaking records, it becomes something marketable that the other companies needed to leverage. And while not everyone is going to notice that Stray Kids write their own music, they're more than likely to feel it. Because even if you don't understand Korean, you could feel the raw energy in their music. It was less about the language and more about the emotion behind it. What had been uncertain at the beginning wasn't as uncertain anymore. The sound made sense, the process was clearer, and once both of those were resolved, the way people and the industry as a whole approached them changed. If you want to see how exhausting Stray Kids' biggest tour, Dominate, actually was, you can click the video on screen. Thanks for watching! Bye 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 bye.